Today we live in a very music-oriented world. We hear music in our everyday lives, whether it's driving to work, hearing it on the radio, watching TV shows and watching movies, or just surfing the internet, seeing it being performed online. Well, today I'm just going to inform you a little about the jazz history and the importance of it today in our culture, and also two main historical figures that made jazz music very important. I've always been into music, and it has been my passion ever since I can remember. But this past year, I was able to be in the vocal jazz group at Hutchinson Community College called Vaughnage. And I must say, in that year, it has challenged me more than I have ever known. I know all from you that you love music, but you may not know a lot about the jazz history and the genre. But thankfully, jazz is fun, but it is also very challenging. Since it's challenging, we have an opinion about jazz and that we may think it is easy, but explaining exactly what that is makes the musician worth caring about. Today, I will provide you some information of the history of jazz, the two main historical figures, and the importance of it today in our culture. Let's start from the beginning. According to the Rocking Cradle of Jazz magazine in 2009, New Orleans has often been referred to as the birthplace of jazz, or the incubator of jazz. Jazz was not only birthed in New Orleans, but it also had the two main very important historical figures that we must credit for the accomplishments that they did for the genre. Jazz first came about in the 20th century when the African American slaves were brought from different parts of Africa and the different parts of the Caribbean islands. According to the magazine, The Rocking Cradle of Jazz article, this is where the different cultures and the different ethnic traditions came about. With all the ethnic traditions and the different cultures, they would have all of their different instruments, and that would create the rhythm and the harmonies that we get today calling blues. Not many people know that drums were actually invented by jazz musicians themselves from their different cultured instruments. New Orleans has definitely had great traditions of celebrations from the different types of music. There were folk music, spiritual songs, military bands, and of course the blues that we know today. Now that we've heard a brief overview of the beginning of jazz and the history behind it, I want to tell you a little about the popular historical figures that made jazz music the way it is today. According to the History of Jazz, written by Ted Gloria from the press of the University of Oxford, there are many important historical figures that we know. I'm just going to be talking about two today. The first one is Louis Armstrong. In 1901, he was one of the most influential artists in the history of music. Not only jazz, but music. He started his career at the age of 13 and improvised, which we will talk about a little later, using his voice and using his instrument, the trumpet. He was very famous for his improvised solos and played the popular style Dixieland, which was popular at that time, and everyone loved that type of music. The other popular artist from the jazz genre is Edward Kennedy, also known as Duke Ellington. He studied and learned to play the piano at age 7, and he became a band leader in New York City as a teenager. He is well known and a famous creator, pianist, and really brought out the swing era of that time. So just from these two historical figures, we have from Louis Armstrong to Duke Ellington. They both were playing the same jazz genre, but they were playing different styles, and that's something very unique about jazz music today. Now that I've shared to you about the two main historical figures from the importance of jazz, I'm going to share now about the importance of jazz in today's culture. I interviewed Neil Alsop July 1st he is the director of the choral activities and also the vocal jazz instructor that I'm in at Hutchinson Community College. He presented to me many reasons why jazz is very important in today's society, whether people are a fan of the art of music or they don't care for it at all. During my interview, I asked him why it is important for today's culture. He stated, "Jazz is an artistic, musical micronism of the American and is the melting pot upbringing as a nation." He also said that jazz historically has been a major influence on our culture and pop music of today. Jazz demands the musicians use more of their creative input than almost any other type of genre music. Understanding jazz, he said, the harmonic, rhythm, and melodic syntax found in jazz requires that the listener, in order to have more of a meaning line of communication, has to listen to the revelation in a different way that he's listening to either another type of music like classical or pop music that we know today. According to the history of jazz in the Press University of Oxford, the subject jazz is not only a challenging tune, but it is also created by one's mind. Swing is the basic rhythm of jazz and originated during the Great Depression in the 1930s. People were very fond of dancing and music, and this was also played in clubs called speakeasies. Also, very important in jazz is the improvisation that we know today. Improvisation, according to Ted Gloria, is improvising during a tune, known as creating or making the music up as you go. This can be very challenging, and I know this from experience. After you understand the basics of improvising jazz, jazz is also known for the harmonies and the roots of the chords. Just like Neil Alsop said, many minds that aren't associated with the art of jazz find that jazz is a hard genre to listen to because of the chords and the harmonies that are so close in relevance. The rhythm of the theory of jazz is difficult to follow along if you're not reading music. As a result of learning the art of jazz, it can be very challenging and takes a lot of practice, which I know of. In conclusion today, I've provided with you the history of jazz, the two main figures of jazz that made it very important, and also why we need to know why jazz is important today. If you ever have a chance to study or perform jazz, you need to do it because it is very challenging and it will inspire you so much. I'm just so glad that I learned all that I have of being a part of this vocal jazz group. So I hope you can learn that too.